Surprise! If you know my teaching style, I wanted to include a practice in here. Essentially, you're just going to be rewriting that same line of code that we just wrote in the last lesson. However, this time we'll extend it just a little bit. I want you to see if you can figure out how to render an unordered list with 2 or more list items inside. Last time we just rendered a paragraph. You can see it's still kind of left over here. If I refresh that, that'll disappear. I've left the entire setup here for you. We're still pulling in the script tags for React, React DOM, and Babel. So essentially, your main focus is just to rewrite that same one-liner of code, but see if you can figure out how to add a couple more elements inside, like having an unordered list with some nested list items. Pause here and try to work on that challenge. Okay, pulling in the React DOM library that gives us access to a render method. Before we did a simple paragraph like this and put some code inside. However, I can put this as an unordered list and then just actually stick some list items inside of here. So it's going to look a little confusing at first. I'll clean it up in just a minute. We have list item, we'll just say thing 1, and I'll do another list item here, thing 2. Okay, now I'm going to move this onto its own line here, this whole HTML thing right there. And the second parameter I need to separate with a comma is where to put this. So I'm going to use document.getElementById root. And let's cross our fingers, see how this goes. Cool. Okay, hopefully that was some good practice. Now let's keep moving forward and learn a little bit more about why we care about React. One more thing that was highly requested from the first time I recorded this React course was how can I set this up on my local environment? Everything that I'm doing will be done on scrimba.com so that you can interact with the same code that you see me writing. However, it's also a good experience to run it locally on your own computer and get a feel for what it would be like to actually develop React on your own computer. Again, our setup here is more of the easy way than the right way, but for now what you can do is you can click the little gear icon in the lower right of your Scrimba editor, which will pop up a little menu here, and there's an option that says download as zip. That will download a zip file containing the files that we're working on here. You can uncompress that like you normally would any zip file and open that up in any editor that you'd like, for example, Visual Studio Code on your own machine. Now, in order for that to run, I'm going to show you what that looks like on Visual Studio Code. Inside of Visual Studio Code, which is what you see in this screenshot, there's a menu icon for some extensions, and you'll need to search for an extension called Live Server. It's created by Ritwick Day, and you'll need this installed to your VS Code in order to run the code that we have written in React. So you'll click the little install button. That's going to put an icon down at the very bottom menu bar in Visual Studio Code that says Go Live, and all you need to do is click that Go Live button, which will open a web page on a local server. I think it's maybe port 5000 that it runs, and that should launch your own React project on your local machine. As soon as you see me move toward a different setup for React that includes Webpack and downloaded dependencies from NPM and so forth, this is no longer going to work in quite the same way. But for now, for those that are curious, I thought I might just explain how you can get this set up on your own machine. Okay, that's enough delaying. Let's keep moving forward with the course. Let's talk for a second about JavaScript libraries and JavaScript frameworks. At this point in your learning journey, you may have heard these terms before and wondered really what the difference between them was or what they were in general. So let's jump right in. First, we'll talk about what a library is. A library is simply a collection of reusable code. It's code that someone else has written, I guess unless you are the author of your own library, that tries to reduce the need to write the repetitive or complex things that you sometimes find yourself having to write over and over again from scratch. Adding a library to your existing project is a really common thing to do. You bring in the code from a library to help try and solve a specific problem that you're facing in your already existing code base. As such, you get to control how and when that library or the code from that library is used. There's very few boundaries. Of course, there's going to be documentation on how to use that library, but the library often will not really care what the scenario is in which you're using it. Some tasks that are solved by libraries include things like data visualization, dealing with date times and time zones. Sometimes they can be really small, like making the text in your terminal show up as a different color, or they might be a bit more overarching and be something like the React library, whose job is to give you a declarative and composable way to build in the front end. Now, it's arguably debatable to legitimately call React a library these days. It handles so many things that some people do tend to consider it more of a framework than a library. In truth, I personally think it's a bit esoteric to debate whether it's a library or a framework because in the end, it doesn't really matter. But speaking of frameworks, a framework is generally different than a library in that it has a predetermined architecture. Rather than pulling it into your existing code base, you often will start a new project, or at least a portion of your project, by following the predetermined pattern given by the framework. As such, you have to work within the boundaries that are set by the framework. Usually there is a right way to do something in the framework that you're using. The JavaScript ecosystem is very quickly evolving. I thought it could be kind of fun to look at a bit of the history of some of the popular libraries and frameworks that have come through the front-end development world. In 2006, jQuery was introduced. I'm guessing this is not the first time you've heard of jQuery. It was around for a very long time, and its goal was to make interacting with the DOM much easier than it was at the time, especially with the kinds of differences that developers had to deal with in 2006 between each browser, or in other words, dealing with cross-browser compatibility. jQuery not only gave a more terse and simplified syntax for interacting with the DOM, but it also reduced significantly the friction for developers when they had to consider every different environment that their code might be run in. Then just a few years later, starting in 2010, some of the biggest initial frameworks started emerging. AngularJS at the time was just called Angular. Ember, Backbone. If you've been in web development for a while, you probably recognize these names. AngularJS was written by Google and had a huge adoption rate. In fact, when I first started learning front-end, I jumped right into AngularJS. A few years later, another group of frameworks or libraries emerged, namely React, Angular 2 at the time as it was called. Now the names have switched a little bit. The modern version of Angular is just called Angular, and the old version was rebranded as AngularJS, and Vue.js. And I'm positive you at least recognize one of these names as we are now talking about React in this course, but surely as you've done your research, you have also heard of Angular and Vue, and just a few years after these came out, Svelte came on the scene, and these four frameworks or libraries here consist of probably the largest number of developers that are using them today for front-end web development. So of all the libraries and frameworks we see here, why are we choosing to teach React? For me, the primary reason to teach React over any other library or framework is that it has the highest demand for jobs. Of course, when you're looking for a job, you want to be able to demonstrate that you're capable of learning any library or framework or even language that you might need to learn for that job. However, choosing to learn the library that has the most number of jobs available already, frankly, it just makes a lot of sense. React also has the largest ecosystem of any of the other libraries or frameworks that we saw. From a learner's perspective, it also contains contains less magic happening behind the scenes. In other words, in React, a lot of times the right way to do something is by using vanilla JavaScript. This allows learners of React to rely more heavily on the JavaScript ecosystem and to generally become better JavaScript developers rather than developers specific to whatever library they're learning. As far as I know, all of the libraries today have a strong focus on composability and having a declarative paradigm for coding. If those words don't make sense to you, that's okay. The next two scrims are going to be talking about these specifically. And React is still under active development. There's a strong community and a strong support system behind React that helps it continue to evolve as time passes on. At least at the time of recording this, React has been around for a decade now, and it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. So with so many jobs being available in React or any of these other frameworks, you might be asking yourself, do I really even need to learn JavaScript before I just jump right into React? And my personal, unhesitating, emphatic answer is absolutely yes. As an educator, I cannot imagine a world in which I would choose to teach React as a way of also teaching JavaScript. Conflating the core language of JavaScript or interacting with the DOM in JavaScript with how React chooses to handle interactions with the DOM, I strongly believe would be the absolute wrong approach to learning web development. This is why in the very introduction to this course, I strongly emphasize that a prior knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript will be necessary before continuing on in React. You certainly don't want to find yourself in an interview or in a position somewhere where it becomes clear that you don't understand the difference between the core language and the framework or library itself. Now, I've really talked up the whole using a library thing. However, there's going to be plenty of times when you might not want a framework at all. If you're working in a small project, installing the entire React library just to build one little view is probably going to be overkill for what you need. Also, using these libraries or frameworks does include a significant amount of overhead that has to be downloaded to your users' machines. If you have concerns about the network speed of where your app is going to be used, then maybe a framework is going to be overkill for you. There's also a more significant learning curve. Assuming you already understand how to interact with the DOM in JavaScript, learning React isn't quite as simple as just spending 15 minutes looking at the documentation. There also could be some maintenance concerns as React or whatever framework you're using evolves. Trying to keep your app as updated as possible with the newest version will include some overhead, or you might be working in an existing project and that project may not be very compatible, or at least not easily compatible, with introducing a completely new framework. In all of web development, there's going to be trade-offs, and these are just a few things you might want to consider before jumping both feet into learning a new framework. Okay, let's come back to some of these topics that we were just talking about, and next we're going to dive into understanding React's composable and declarative nature. Let's spend a little bit of time understanding why we even care to learn React. One of the main reasons that people will talk about is how React allows us to write composable code. So what exactly do I mean by composable? Well, an analogy that I came up with has to do with sculpting. If you think of the statue of David, for example, this statue was created originally from a single giant block of marble that was then sculpted down to the sculpture that we know today. So in the end, what results is one giant single piece that makes up this piece of art. Now, what if instead of starting with one giant piece, we instead used a bunch of small pieces to put together something that is greater? These are Lego bricks that obviously are small, each in their own right, that were put together to create something large. In this example, they all kind of work together to accomplish a goal, so to speak, the goal of looking like the statue of David. Now, this example is not perfect because the original statue of David obviously is more beautiful than this replica made of Lego bricks. But hopefully the concept makes sense. Let's look at an example in actual web development. What I have here is copy and pasted from the Bootstrap website. If you're not familiar with Bootstrap, that's really not important right now, but it's enough to know that these 30 or 40 lines of code copy and pasted from the Bootstrap website represent a navigation bar that is pre-styled. Now, in the old days of web development, a single page on a website was usually a single HTML page. So if this is just the nav bar, a lot of times those web pages would end up being thousands and thousands of lines of HTML code, essentially making it one giant sculpture. Well, with modern frameworks like React, we can take code like this and we can put it into our own custom components, and we can put those components together to make something that is larger. But in our case, our code becomes a lot more maintainable and a lot more flexible. You can see I've given these kind of silly names to show you that these are not regular HTML elements. I can combine elements together that are real HTML elements, like you see here, into my own custom component called, for example, my awesome navbar or my awesome footer. We're not quite ready to dive into the syntax of React quite yet, but I'm going to give you a taste of it and a chance to play with it before we move on. So let's see this in practice. Over here, you can see I have my React DOM.render, and I'm rendering a custom component called navbar. And if I scroll up, you'll get a chance to see how I created that navbar. As a quick aside, one thing you might notice is that I'm using class name everywhere instead of class. That's not a mistake. That's just how you have to assign classes in React. We're going to cover that later. But for now, I'd like to give you a challenge that's going to require you to deduce what I've done here and try to replicate it for yourself. So let me put that here. Okay, your challenge is to see the navbar component that I have created and see if you can deduce how to create your own component called main content. It can return something really simple like a single h1 element, and afterwards I want you to render it below the navbar. You'll have to figure out how to render it below the navbar. Now, I've changed this a little bit for reasons that we'll talk about soon, but this line here, 51, this is where you're going to figure out how to render your own custom component main content. So first, build your custom component, looking at my example above to try and figure out how to do that, and secondly, render that component down here in React DOM.render. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, following the example above, we see that I created this component by creating a function, and the name of the function is the name of my component. So I will open up that function and return the content that I want to show up on my page. Above, I created a set of parentheses because I have many elements that I'm trying to return. I'll just do that just to keep things consistent for now. We'll create our h1 that says I'm learning React. And secondly, I can take my main content and I can render it by making it look kind of like an HTML element. In this case, it's a self-closing one, so I have main content as a single tag here, and if I hit save, we'll see that my h1 actually showed up on my page. And that's the concept of composability. It goes quite a bit deeper than this. We're going to see how we can make our components much more composable and reusable, but for now, let's move on to another reason why people really love React, and we'll cover that in the next lesson. Another major reason people love React is because it's something that we call declarative. So let's talk about declarative. To understand declarative, it's helpful to know that its opposite is something called imperative. When a program is declarative, we can simply tell it what should be done. More specifically, it's like the computer saying, just tell me what to do and I'll worry about all the nitty-gritty details on how to get it done. Its opposite, imperative, is when we need to tell the program how it should be done. Like the computer saying, I need you to describe to me every step along the way how to do something and then I'll do it. Up until now, if you've mostly been just using vanilla JavaScript anytime you needed to create elements on the page, you've been doing it in an imperative way. In fact, let's go look at what that has been like. I've commented out my React DOM.render and I'm going to put a challenge here for you. Okay, your challenge is to recreate this above line of code where we are rendering something to the screen using vanilla JavaScript by creating and appending an h1 to our div with the ID of root. We have our div ID of root. You'll need to select it and then append a new element. And I give you the step-by-step instructions right here. One little caveat is I don't want you using inner HTML because that kind of breaks the analogy down a little bit. Generally speaking, this is actually just a good way to practice the vanilla JavaScript that you have been learning so far. So it's always good to give it some practice. I'll give you a couple lines here, pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, let's work on this. So I'm going to create an h1 and I'll use document.createElement and I'll make an h1. And then if I'm giving it some text content, I need to use the text content property of this DOM node and set it equal to, I don't know, maybe this is an imperative way to program. Then I need to give it a class name. So I'll use the class name property here and set it equal to, I think we said header. And finally, I need to append it to my div with the ID of root. So first I need to say document get element by ID root and then use the append property or method to append my h1 to the DOM. So when I hit save, it should show up. This is an imperative way to program. Perfect. Now this example is a little bit on the nose because if you were really just putting something static that had nothing to do with user interaction, you probably would just go to your HTML page and stick it right inside the div here, right? But with React, we're building our entire page in JavaScript. And so doing something imperatively this way where I have to tell it step by step how to create the element and then to add some text content and then add a class name and then append it to the DOM, that's going to get old pretty fast, especially even with something mildly more complicated than a single H1, like a very simple web page like this. As soon as we have more than one element, suddenly our 4 lines of code will become probably dozens or maybe even hundreds of lines of JavaScript code just to create and append all of these elements in the correct order and in the correct way. And so that brings us back to the idea of writing our code declaratively, and React allows us to do that in a really simple way. As we see back up top, when we comment this out and uncomment this, we essentially get to write our JavaScript as if it were HTML. We are relying on React to figure out how to turn what we have declaratively written as an H1 into the JavaScript code that's needed to append it to the DOM. In fact, if I were being strict and wanted to make this more equivalent, in order to add a class name, I can just add a class name as if this were an HTML element. Again, this is class name instead of class for a good reason, which we'll talk about, but that's a pretty minor difference to be able to do all of these lines of code in one single section right here. And that difference is going to compound as we get into more and more complicated UIs like we see here. So at this point, I could probably continue talking about different reasons that we're choosing to use React and that it will be really beneficial for you to learn React. As you see on my little list here, it's a very hireable skill and it's actively maintained by really skilled people at Facebook. However, at this point, I think we're overdue to just jump into the syntax, get your hands on the keyboard and start learning